The Wyoming wind was a hungry beast, and in the heart of winter it never slept. It tore across the white plains, clawing at the cabin that stood alone against the storm. The sky hung low and bruised, pressing down on the frozen land like a curse. Inside that small cabin, Luke Callahan sat by the fire, his broad shoulders casting a heavy shadow on the wall. He was a man built from the same hard ground he worked, silent, solid, and unbending. 3 years had passed since he buried Martha, his wife, and the stillborn child that had broken her heart. Since then, the silence had become his companion. He didn't talk to neighbors, didn't visit the nearby settlement. His life was reduced to the rhythm of ranch work, feeding the stock, mending fences, chopping wood, and sleeping under a roof he'd built with his own 2 hands. But even for a man of stone, silence could bite deep. Some nights, lying on the cold side of the bed, he'd feel that ache, the one that wasn't just loneliness but something sharper. It wasn't love he missed. He told himself that often. It was simply the sound of another soul moving through the cabin, the scent of bread baking, a voice answering when he spoke. When he finally sent that letter to a matrimonial agency back east, it was not an act of hope, but of practicality. He'd written plainly describing his cabin, his cattle, and the kind of life a woman could expect with him. Hard, cold, and honest. He asked for no beauty, no affection, only a willing worker and a steady hand. It wasn't romance, it was survival. Weeks later, a circuit rider brought him a reply. The handwriting was neat and feminine, the paper smelling faintly of lavender. Mr. Callahan, I am a woman of health and of quiet nature. I can cook, clean, and sew. I have known hardship and am not afraid of work. I ask only for safety and a place to belong. Yours respectfully, Clara Thompson. Luke read the letter twice, expressionless. Then he fed it to the fire and watched it curl into ash. The next morning, he rode 20 miles to Fort Laramie and wired money for her train fare. The day she arrived was clear but cruelly cold. The sky was pale steel, and the wind blew thin as glass. Luke stood at the depot, tall and motionless, his breath white in the air. The train whistle echoed across the plains, a long, lonesome cry, and then the black engine rolled in, hissing and groaning. When the passengers began stepping down, he saw her immediately. Clara Thompson was a small, thin woman with a face too pale for the West. Her coat was worn, her hands gloved in thin fabric that did nothing against the cold, but what caught him wasn't her frailty, it was her eyes. They were gray, like the sky before a storm, but steady, defiant, alive. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Callahan," she answered softly, meeting his gaze. He took her bag without asking and led her to the wagon. They rode in silence through the snow-packed trail, the only sound, the creak of the wheels and the soft snort of the horses. Halfway home, he noticed her trembling. Without a word, he pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and handed it to her. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching it close. The cabin came into view near dusk, a small shape crouched against the endless white. Smoke rose from its chimney, the only sign of life in a dead world. He halted the wagon and helped her down. His touch was brief, almost reluctant. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and leather. The cabin was divided by a heavy curtain. One side held a rough-hewn table, a fireplace, and shelves lined with tools and supplies. The other side hid a bed and a small trunk. "That room there's yours," he said, pointing toward a narrow door near the corner. "Water's from the well out back. You'll need to break the ice most mornings. Firewood's in the box." She looked at the tiny cot behind the door, then at the larger bed behind the curtain. A question flickered in her eyes. Luke understood it but gave no room for discussion. "You'll sleep there tonight," he said flatly. It was not kindness. It was control. They ate supper in silence, beans and salt pork on tin plates. He didn't speak, didn't ask about her journey, didn't thank her for the meal she'd quietly helped prepare. When the dishes were done, he said only, "Extra blankets in the chest. You'll need 'em." then disappeared behind the curtain. Clara stood alone by the fire, the light painting her face in gold and shadow. The storm outside howled, a reminder of the wilderness she'd stepped into. She felt small, fragile, but strangely calm. She had known worse cages than this one. In her small room, she lay awake long after the fire burned low. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the curtain, steady, deep, and far away. The silence between them felt alive, stretching wider than the Wyoming plains. She turned her face toward the wall and let a single tear fall. Days passed in a harsh routine. Clara rose before dawn, split ice on the well, milked the cow, cooked, mended, scrubbed. Her hands blistered and bled, but she did not complain. Luke watched her work with the same cold focus he gave his cattle. He never raised his voice, but his silence was its own judgment. When she burned the bread, he said nothing. When she fumbled with the harness, his sigh said enough. It was a silence she recognized, a silence that once came before pain. One night, her past crept back in dreams. She woke with a cry, heart pounding, tears hot on her face. On the other side of the curtain, Luke's eyes snapped open. He lay still, listening to her muffled sobs. He told himself it was none of his concern. But he didn't sleep again until her weeping quieted. The next morning, he left a tin cup on the floor outside her door. Steam rose from it, wild mint tea. He was already outside chopping wood when she found it. Clara picked it up with trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, and for the first time she felt something stir inside her chest that she hadn't felt in years. It was not love. It was the faintest glimmer of hope. Winter deepened over the Wyoming plains. Each morning began with the crack of Luke's axe striking ice, the hiss of cold wind pushing against the cabin walls, and the soft clatter of Clara moving quietly around the fire. Days had fallen into rhythm, but the silence between them remained, thick, cold, and unbroken. Luke watched her from the corner of his eye as she worked, never speaking unless necessary. Yet something in the air was changing. Her movements had grown surer, her posture straighter. She had begun to belong to the land in small ways, her cheeks pink from the wind, her sleeves rolled, her hands rough from labor. The woman who had arrived, trembling in a threadbare coat, now faced the wild with a stubborn kind of grace. One morning, as the pale sun rose over the hills, Luke found her outside, struggling with one of his heavy wool blankets at the washing line. The wet fabric weighed more than she did. She was fighting to wring it dry, her face red with effort. Before she could speak, he stepped forward, grabbed one end, and twisted. Water splashed onto the snow in a cold wave. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Their hands moved together, strong and sure, twisting the thick wool in perfect rhythm. The moment was brief, wordless, but when the blanket finally hung between them, dripping in the sunlight, something subtle had shifted. He looked at her, and for the first time, didn't see a burden. He saw a woman who worked beside him, not beneath him. Later that afternoon, Luke told her to fetch her coat. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff. "You'll learn to set snares before the snow buries everything." She followed him into the woods, her breath puffing white in the frozen air. The forest was still, the branches heavy with snow. Luke showed her the narrow trails where rabbits passed, how to bend a sapling and loop the wire so it would tighten fast. His words were short, practical, but to Clara, they felt like something more. He was teaching her his world, opening a door he'd long kept locked. When he finished, he leaned against a pine tree, staring out into the silent woods. "You'll need to check the traps early," he said quietly. "Coyotes'll get to 'em if you wait too long." Clara hesitated, then asked softly, "Did you build the cabin yourself?" He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Martha helped," he said finally. "She picked the spot, said the morning sun hit it just right." His voice cracked faintly on her name. "She died in that bed. Fever, after the boy came. He didn't last the night." Clara didn't speak. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying his words away. She simply looked at him, her gray eyes steady, filled not with pity but understanding. In that gaze, he saw no judgment, only the quiet recognition of pain. For the first time in 3 years, Luke didn't turn away. He just nodded once, as if accepting something he couldn't name. That night, the wind outside began to howl. The air grew sharp and thin. When Luke stepped out to bring in firewood, he saw the horizon darken into a solid wall of blue-black cloud. The smell of snow filled the air. He pushed through the door. "Blizzard's coming," he said, "a bad one." Within minutes, they were both moving in urgent silence. She hauled in more logs while he brought the horses into the lean-to. Snow began to fall thick and fast, blanketing the world in white. By the time he barred the cabin door, the storm had swallowed everything beyond the window. For 2 days the blizzard raged, the wind screaming like a living thing. The cabin trembled, snow pressed hard against the windows, and the fire never stopped burning. By the second night, Clara's small room had turned into a frozen box of air. When she rose to leave for it, Luke spoke her name for the first time. "Clara." The sound of it startled both of them. "You'll freeze in there. Stay by the fire tonight." She hesitated, heart pounding. "Where?" He nodded toward the large bed behind the curtain. "It's warm enough there. I'll take the floor." But when she protested, he shook his head. "Don't argue." She obeyed. The firelight danced against the log walls as she lay on one side of the bed, still as stone. Luke settled on the other, a thick roll of blankets between them like a barrier. They didn't touch, didn't speak. The only sound was the storm and the faint tremor of her breathing. Sometime in the dark hours before dawn, her foot brushed his leg. Both froze. The contact was small, accidental, but the air between them changed. On the third night, the storm reached its peak. Snow howled against the roof, and the cold cut through the walls like knives. Clara woke, shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering even under the quilts. She turned, seeking warmth, and her trembling hand found his back beneath the blanket. Her fingers brushed over the old scar that ran from his shoulder down to his hip, a ridge of pain and history. He went still, every muscle locked, but when she pulled away, he caught her hand. "Don't," he whispered, his voice raw. Her hand stayed. Slowly, she moved closer until her forehead rested against his back, her breath warming his skin. The distance between them melted away, the years of silence collapsing like snow under the weight of truth. He turned toward her. Their eyes met in the dark. There were no words, only need. Raw, human, desperate. They reached for each other not out of passion, but survival. The storm raged outside. But inside that small cabin, for the first time in years, Luke felt warmth that came from something more than fire. When dawn finally came, the blizzard was over. The world outside glowed white and new. But inside the cabin, silence returned, colder, heavier than before. Luke rose without a word, stoked the fire, and dressed for the day. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of his silence cutting deeper than any storm. The warmth of the night before had turned to ice. As the door closed behind him, she felt it, the shatter of something fragile. Not her hope, not her heart, her dignity. And for the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming, she felt truly, utterly alone. The sun rose weak and pale over the Wyoming plains, its light reflecting off a world buried in snow. The storm had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavy as lead. Luke Callahan worked outside from dawn till dusk, his face locked in grim focus, his movements mechanical. He repaired fences that didn't need fixing, shoveled paths that would be buried again by nightfall. Anything to avoid the cabin. Anything to avoid her eyes. Inside, Clara moved like a ghost. She cooked, cleaned, mended his clothes, and tended the fire. But she felt invisible again, as if the storm had swept her voice away. The warmth they had shared, the fragile spark that had almost bridged the frozen gulf between them, had vanished under the weight of his pride. Each night, they lay in the same bed out of necessity, the distance between them wider than the wilderness itself. He faced the wall, she faced the fire. Words died before they reached their lips. A week later, A knock at the door broke the suffocating routine. It was Silas Blackwood, a rugged neighbor from the next valley. He was planning a hunting trip in the Laramie Range and wanted Luke to come along. Luke agreed, before Clara could even ask where or why. He needed to get away, from her, from himself, from the silence that now screamed louder than any blizzard. "I'll be gone 4, maybe 5 days," he said that evening while cleaning his rifle. "Wood stacked, water's in the barrels. You'll be fine." Clara nodded, her face unreadable. He didn't look at her when he left the next morning, didn't say goodbye, didn't turn around. The cabin door closed, and with it went the last illusion that she was anything more than a housekeeper in his world. That night, she sat by the fire and opened her small valise. From it, she took a stack of letters, the ones she'd written in secret since the day she arrived. Letters to no one, filled with thoughts she'd never dared to speak. Letters that told of the land, the loneliness, and the strange, distant man who haunted her days. Among them was one older than all the rest, worn and creased from years of being carried close. It spoke of her first husband, Arthur, a man who had charmed her with poetry, then trapped her in a cage of silence and cruelty. She'd lived under the shadow of his temper, surviving by shrinking herself until she was nearly invisible. She'd promised that when she escaped, she'd never live that way again. But now, sitting in Luke Callahan's cabin, she realized she had done exactly that. His silence was different from Arthur's, but it was still a prison. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "Luke, I am writing because words spoken to you would vanish into silence. You understand quiet better than anyone I've known, but your quiet builds walls instead of bridges. I cannot live behind another man's walls. I came here for safety, and in your way, you gave me that. But I also found something else. I found you, the man who left tea for me when I screamed in the night, the man who worked beside me in the snow. I saw the good in you, the gentleness you hide behind pride. For one night I thought you saw me too, but when the sun rose you turned your back. You chose your grief again. I will not live unseen, Luke. I cannot be a ghost for another man's peace. I am leaving, not because I stopped caring, but because I started to. Clara." She folded the letter and placed it on the table where he would see it first. Then she packed her few things, her spare dress, her letters, her courage, and stepped into the cold. When Luke returned 3 days later, the air felt wrong before he even reached the cabin. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no footprints in the snow, no sound. He burst through the door, calling her name, his voice echoing in the stillness. The fire was out, the bed neatly made, the cabin too clean, too empty, and on the table one thing waited. A letter. He unfolded it with trembling hands and read every word slowly, as if each one carved deeper into him. By the end, his knees nearly gave out. His chest burned with something he couldn't name. Grief, shame, loss, all tangled together. He sank into the chair, the paper shaking in his hands. For the first time since Martha's death, Luke Callahan wept. When the tears finally stopped, something inside him broke open. The silence that had been his armor for years was gone, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and desperate. He found her valise under the cot in her room. She had left it behind. Inside were the letters she had written and never sent. He read them all through the night. Her words painted his life in a way he had never seen it. The loneliness she bore, the small mercies she cherished, the love she had dared to offer him. By dawn he realized the truth. He had become the very thing he hated most, a man who let love die in silence. He couldn't stay another minute. Before the morning sun cleared the ridge, he saddled his best horse and rode hard for the nearest town. At the depot, the station master confirmed what he already feared. She had boarded the eastbound stage 2 days earlier, bound for Omaha. Luke stared at the horizon. He could still turn back, crawl into the shell of his old life, and let pride finish what it had started. But something inside him, something Clara had awakened, refused to let him. He spurred his horse east. For days he rode across the endless plains, through biting cold and sleepless nights. In every small town he asked the same question. You seen a woman, gray eyes, eastern, quiet? Most shook their heads. But in Prairie View, Nebraska, an innkeeper remembered her. She's teaching at the schoolhouse, the woman said kindly. Sweet lady, the children love her. Luke rode there at once. He found the whitewashed building nestled among cottonwoods, sunlight pouring through its windows. He dismounted and walked quietly to the side, where he could see inside. Clara stood at the front of the class, reading aloud to a circle of young girls. Her smile was gentle, radiant. The woman he saw now was not the fragile bride from the train. She was whole, strong, alive. He couldn't move. The sight of her filled him with pride and pain in equal measure. He wanted to go to her, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. But he knew doing so would steal the peace she had earned. So instead, he rode to town, rented a small room, and sat at a table with pen and paper. It took him all night, but he finally wrote what he should have said long ago. My dearest Clara, I found you. I saw you smiling, and I saw that you are free. You were right. My silence was not strength, it was fear. I have lived my life afraid of loss, and because of it, I lost everything. But you have taught me that love is not a cage. It is the courage to let someone in, even if it breaks you. I love you. I will not ask you to return. I only ask that you believe these words and know they are true. Luke. Before dawn, he slid the letter under the schoolhouse door and rode away without looking back. When Clara found it that morning, her hands trembled as she read. The words melted the last of her anger and filled her with something bright and unshakable. He wasn't asking her to come back. He was giving her the freedom to choose. By sundown, she had packed her few belongings and boarded the westbound stage. 2 days later, she stood once again at the edge of the valley, the cabin rising against the pale winter sky. There was smoke from the chimney this time, and a faint smell of baked apples in the air. When she opened the door, Luke stood by the fire, flour on his hands, a wooden spoon in his grasp. He turned. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Then he knelt, awkwardly, clumsily, and held out a small silver ring. He didn't beg, didn't command. He simply looked up at her, eyes shining with something pure and humble. She went to him and cupped his face in her hands, her voice soft as falling snow. Yes, Luke. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his rough hands trembling. The world outside was still frozen, but inside that cabin, spring had finally come. For the first time he smiled, not as a proud rancher, not as a broken man, but as a husband reborn from his own silence.